a one of my colleagues and friends who is going to speak to us today. Carole Piovesan is the managing partner at INQ Law, where she focuses on privacy, cyber incident response, data governance, and AI risk management. She's a trusted advisor to clients on privacy compliance, cyber readiness, breach response, ethical AI, and responsible innovation. A former co-head of a national cybersecurity, privacy, and data management group at a leading law firm, Carole is also a seasoned litigator who has appeared before all levels of court in Ontario and the Supreme Court of Canada. She's ranked by Chambers Canada in privacy and data protection and recognized by best lawyers in technology law and healthcare law. Welcome, Carole. Thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so grateful to be here so early on in the year, too, which I really appreciate because there's a lot we're expecting in the world of AI and law this year, as tumultuous as this area has been. So before I dive in, I just want to give you context as to what I want you to get out of this session. Okay, so this is a multidisciplinary program. You all come from different backgrounds. And what I want you to be able to do at the end of this session is at least understand how some of us on the legal side are thinking about the concerns with AI and what we're doing about it, okay? And I want you to be able to trace back to why we have those concerns or why we're thinking about it in that way. Now, I take it everyone can see my screen okay? No issue? Thumbs up?
Yes, yes.
Got it. Okay, perfect. So let's start with something you already know. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to what the intention of artificial intelligence is. And I always go back here because it matters to me what we're trying to achieve and how close we are to achieving it. So when I go back to the one of the seminal papers by Dr. Turing around can computers think, and really trying to apply that Turing test to understand whether the output of a computer system could be so human-like that it could be confusing to a reader that doesn't know who the producer of that output is. When I think about that, it is a very important indicator to me about what we are trying to achieve with artificial intelligence. And right there, we are trying to understand, and going back to his original thinking, can computers demonstrate intelligence and act on that intelligence in a way that would be confusing as to whether or not it was a human or a computer system doing it? In my mind, meaning, can a computer start to demonstrate actions, processes, and actions and outputs that seem very human, that have human-like, I guess, qualities, okay? And by all accounts, we're getting closer and closer and closer to a realization of that test. So by all accounts that I've read, and by please disagree where you feel you need to, but in looking, I think this comes from the sources right there, the AI index for Stanford, demonstrating in certain areas there that AI is starting to meaningfully surpass human capabilities. And in some of these areas, it includes things like complex reasoning. So it's not applicable across the board. We've all seen some of the outputs of GPT-5 that were a little bit lackluster, promising PhD level outputs, and then it would be tested in some pretty simple areas, and it wasn't demonstrating that at all. But we know that AI is improving in its capabilities, and even today, even 2 years ago, in some areas, it was starting to perform much better, on par or much better than humans. And I can tell you, in my world of law, when there were AI computer systems that were ultimately marking up contracts as well or better than some of the best lawyers, same with non-disclosure agreements, it became pretty striking to us that in our world that's very sort of knowledge and judgment heavy, that you've got these computer systems that in certain areas can do it faster and better than even some of the best lawyers. So we can see that Turing's initial vision and those that followed some of his teachings, what that concept of artificial intelligence and what it's trying to achieve is starting to be materialized in today's date. And the anticipation going forward is that it's only getting better, and the capabilities will only become more accurate and more reliable. Not to mention, it is a very general purpose technology. So this is a technology that is applied and has very significant implications across a number of different domains when you think about AI and society. And so when we look at sort of the use, and we can see this so clearly right now in the US's approach to how they are trying to dominate in the world of AI, recognizing it as a distinct competitive advantage, but also national security advantage, pitched especially up against China. So we can see that in many different aspects of AI, of society, AI has an important role to play. When it comes to the use of AI by government and who controls that, sort of the configurations of those systems and the data flows of those systems. Right now, our government, the new government, has talked extensively about data sovereignty. How do we set up cloud infrastructure so that Canada's data can remain within Canada, controlled by Canadians, which right now it is absolutely not. It is, maybe resident in Canada, maybe not, certainly not controlled by Canadian headquartered companies. They are all US headquartered companies, US initiated companies that may have subsidiaries here in Canada. But it's an important topic for our government. Same when we look at some of our social values like privacy. We'll drill on that for a little bit, but thinking about the concept of the way individuals can shield themselves from the judgment of others and from the judgment of the state, from the oversight of the state, and the extent to which now artificial intelligence may be able to hoover up so much data that's out there, often with very limited repercussions, although increasingly there are some, and the implications on our privacy that translates often to how we exercise our freedom. Okay, this is an important value-based discussion that we have to confront as we onboard more and more artificial intelligence in core areas. Protected rights and human rights are another area that we're seeing a lot of interaction between AI and society. And I'll just jump forward a little bit to the labor market and the economy. So we've got all of the big four consulting firms putting out thought leadership pieces about how AI will generate trillions into the global economy by 2030, 2035. If you don't get on board, you're going to lose as a result, but there are labor market implications for this as well. So to the extent that these systems are becoming much more autonomous, there will be a corresponding labor market impact. And are we ready for that? So all of these different areas, as the technology becomes more sophisticated, all of these different areas start to become catalyzed, and the law has a bearing on each of these areas. So the law has a role to play in each of the areas of labor market, of privacy, of human rights. Geopolitics to an extent, although I wouldn't hold that out too far. But certainly in different areas of how we structure our own societies. And so the reason I think AI is quite unique at law, because I get this question all the time, and I have ever since I got into this space. So why do we care about artificial intelligence as lawyers? Other than it seems like a shiny new area where you could make a lot of money as a lawyer deconstructing the complex, what actually matters about this? Well, I usually break it down to four key components that I think makes AI unique at law. So the first is just to set a basic principle. The law is there. It is a code of rules and values and principles that govern human behavior. So it tells you what you can or cannot do, or the expectations in general at a high level, the rules of the game. Okay. And the game being how we live in society with each other in an orderly manner. So the law is there to help us understand those rules. But what becomes really complex is where all of a sudden the rules are not necessarily extended to governing the human behavior. And so the first part of the fact that AI is inorganic, it is not human, it is not you and me, no matter what shape you put the robot in, it doesn't matter. It's still not an organic being. The fact that it is inorganic, that it is self-learning, that over time it is an evolutionary computer system that, as we can see, is getting better and better in its capabilities, often measured, at least in my world, by reliability and accuracy of output. That it can be self-actioning, meaning that in the absence of a direct instruction, the computer system can now assess the information and take an action upon that information. In fact, that is where some of the economic value and financial value lies with artificial intelligence, and that it can produce unintended consequences. So you have a chain of components that now means an inorganic system, not otherwise, that is quote unquote independently understanding its data environment and actioning within that data environment, can produce consequences that are arguably harmful to individuals, to property, to groups. Taken together, this now creates a technology that is unique at law. So this is how I have deconstructed AI since I ever started in this field, almost a decade ago now, really trying to wrap my head around how will the law, the principles of law intended to govern human behavior, ultimately extend to govern AI. And we've seen theorists in the law try to analogize AI to things like your pet, right? You have a pit bull out there. There may be regulations on where you can have a pit bull. There's maybe some cities where you can't have it. If your dog ultimately hurts somebody, you are liable for what your dog has done. But it doesn't work to the same extent, because the pit bull doesn't ultimately get smarter, better, faster, more independent than its owner. And so we are really trying to invent, in some ways, new ways of thinking about this intersection between the law as a body of rules, principles, codes that help us understand the rules of the game, and these inorganic systems that have the capability to, in fact, surpass some of our own intelligence and our own capabilities. So I want to pause really quickly, because in the first 5 minutes, I've already dumped a lot on you, and it's actually pretty complicated. So are there any preliminary questions before I go forward? And don't be shy. Honestly, this is, everybody appreciates this isn't the most straightforward stuff. Okay. So I'll keep going, and we can see how it plays out. So then when we look at different areas of law, and I won't get too deep into this, but I do want you to see how AI interacts with certain kinds of law that you may have already heard of, you may have not a big deal. But it certainly interacts with privacy law. And as I said, we're going to take a beat to look at that in the next slide. But it also interacts, so at its fundamental, when we think about privacy law, we are talking about the data assets that often are used to train or otherwise inform AI systems, and the extent to which those data assets contain personal information. So that's information about you, me, that is either directly identifying me, or when you combine the data points, you can figure out who I am. And are you allowed to use those assets to train those models to produce outputs that might also have an impact on my privacy? And so privacy law has been in place for over 25 years and is bumping up against AI principles because of the way it's constructed. And I'm going to ask you to just hold that in your mind until we get to the next slide. But when we look at contracts, this is where two people come together, they set an agreement, and in that agreement, they determine different elements of their relationship, including who takes the fall if something goes wrong. In my words, who bears the liability, right? And increasingly, we're seeing a whole new body of contracting that's coming out to account specifically for the dynamism of AI, trying to shift that liability depending on whether you are a vendor or a user. And we'll see this, or a deployer. Actually, you've got several different categories. And we will see this most obviously in the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, which is the only, well, it's not the only, but it's the most robust body of law that is horizontal on AI. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We also see it interact with the ethics of law. And I'll just draw your attention also to professional responsibility. So that's very much what lawyers have to hold themselves to in order to be exercising their professional judgment appropriately. And so when we talk about ethics and professional responsibility, the only reason I'm putting them together is because as lawyers, we will hold ourselves to a certain ethical standard, and we're required to do that. And if we're using AI to exercise judgment or to give you advice, for instance, if you're a user of legal services, then we still own the responsibility to make sure that whatever you hear or whatever advice you're given is accurate. So we're right now in a really tough spot where we can't really be using this technology in that way without risking some serious blowback. The other issue with ethics is that often people come to lawyers thinking that we are the right ethical guides. And actually, that's not our profession. Our profession is not, while ethics can be embodied in law, it is not necessarily. And so I always turn to actual ethicists. If you want a proper ethical analysis, you have to go to an ethicist. If you want to understand what the ceiling to floor looks like in terms of what you can do, that's where I step in. And then we also see areas of human rights that I've already discussed, but a big one is intellectual property. So that is the protection of inventions, ideas, text, not actually ideas, but writing and creations that are intended to protect what humans build, what humans create, what humans invent. And we've seen this so much at the heart of the AI and law debate with companies like Stable Diffusion that are putting out AI generated images, and artists are turning around and saying, hey, wait a second, you can't do that. That looks exactly like mine. You didn't pay for that, and it's copyright protected. Or in the entertainment space, actors, writers, directors coming out seeking protection against the use of AI because it is the ability to replicate these images, the deep fakes that can be created, and the montage that can be put together really puts at risk their own profession. Late last year, I saw a movie that was made soup to nuts from AI. There was no AI, there was no human writer, no human director, no human editor, no human actor, no human anything, no human musician or nothing. It was all AI generated. And I will tell you, it looked AI generated. It looked a bit bizarre. The actors seemed a bit weird, but it was close enough, right? Give it another 2 years and that was amazing. That would be amazing. So to start to think that we could, I don't know if you've seen this in the news, that there's a new Hollywood AI actress. She's completely fictitious. She's getting a lot of attention, as one would expect. She's young and stunning, as one would expect. And she's starting to show up in, at least ostensibly, she's starting to show up in different images. So really, really interesting in how it's starting to interact. And then torts, really at the heart of it, we're thinking about different claims that could be caused, whether it's negligence or some kind of intentional harm that's created, and who do you flow that responsibility to? It's getting actually pretty complicated. So that's sort of the embodiment of AI. And I promised you I was going to drill down on privacy just for a minute to show you how there can be a tension between some of these longstanding principles intended to protect really important centuries old values around how you exercise your own freedom and increasingly the world of AI. So I'll draw your attention first just to the definition, because privacy has, or personal information has, a specific definition at law. And the most important thing about this definition is the combined with other information. So you'll often hear this idea of, well, just de-identify the data and then you can use it for whatever you want. Not so, because if it's A, it's likely easily re-identifiable, and B, once it's re-identified, assuming no direct identifiers like your name or your address, for instance, or your social insurance number, there are other pieces of information that you can string together and you would find out who that person is. Woman, lawyer, brown hair, presented at TMU on January 8th on responsible AI. You can figure out who I am in a second, okay? Unless you think I'm Maura, which would also be fair. All right. Then the sort of foundation of privacy are these fair information principles. And when you think about issues like, without even getting into the heart of what each of these mean, when you think about issues like limiting collection, identifying a purpose, already here that they start to run in conflict or tension with AI, that in some instances at early stages do not have the clearest of purposes and want as much information as possible. And so we are entering this space where we have conflicting, I want to say sort of drivers, and possibly, I wouldn't even say values, but when we look at the possibility of AI, we hear about the same things over and over again, which is, we could cure cancer, we could end climate change. Like, if we just had access to all this data, there's so much we could do, but there's a trade-off, which means we're in tension with those centuries old values, which is protecting that privacy and giving people some kind of ownership over how their information is used. Okay, the other issue that sort of touches on the ethics around AI is what I'd like to think of as the trust gap. So I say it touches on ethics only because we can see that there's a relatively sort of increasing degree of distrust with AI, despite the fact that these systems are being used. So actually, pre-ChatGPT, there was less concern and more excitement about AI than post-ChatGPT, where those metrics started to diverge. And I find that really interesting because it means that there is a public consciousness around AI that is increasingly bumping up against trust. And that touches on the issue of stability that you saw in one of my earlier slides, where people in this transition, if we can't bring trust to the forefront, and yet we push hard on adoption and on transition to an AI-driven world, we really lose a lot of that social cohesion because people are just feeling out of sorts. So we have to deal with that psychology of trust as much as we, and in so doing, I think we start to address the psychology of trust in part by providing regulation. I'll give you an example. I have what a good friend of mine has called the 100-day cough. I don't know if you've heard about it, but there's a nasty flu going around. It's translated into what everyone jokingly, I don't find it funny since I think I have it, but says the 100-day cough. And so I took cough syrup right before this so that I wouldn't spend my entire presentation coughing. You're welcome. However, I took it without even thinking. I didn't even think about it. And I am not big on medicine. Like, I'll suffer through a headache any day. I'm not big on medicine, but I took it without thinking. And the reason I took it without thinking is because there are standards and regulations and laws and tried, tested, and true when it comes to this cough medicine. And I buy the same brand every time. So I don't even think about it, even though I'm ingesting something that is actually a pretty complex compound. I'm ingesting it into the system without thinking, because I trust it, because I trust the brand. I've done this before. I know there's regulation in place. I know there are standards. So without some of those components in a world of AI where we see that there is a trust deficit, if we don't start to address where that trust deficit comes from, if we don't sort of address the anxiety that's associated with this transition, we're going to sort of bump up against that social cohesion part. Okay. What are some of the risks that we're managing? So by and large, when we look at practical risks in the everyday, the things that I have to advise clients on, we're moving across along a spectrum from the traditional risks that have new implications because of AI through to new risks associated directly with artificial intelligence. And I have to take all of what we've already discussed into account when I provide my advice across this spectrum. So the privacy we've talked about, but it's actually a traditional risk. I mean, software companies and innovators, creators have been thinking about privacy for many, many, many years and really adapting to the regulatory environment. But increasingly, we're seeing as we move along the spectrum that we need to be much smarter, better educated, more aligned on where there are more distinct risks associated specifically with this evolutionary self-actioning type system that can produce unintended harmful consequences. And so I sort of move more into the misalignment and hallucination, where these systems can now start to demonstrate a value that is either aligned or not with your organization. And we've seen the examples. I think it was out of Anthropic talking about, I don't know if you saw this, it was a system used to analyze email. It was a controlled setting, but it was intended to analyze email of an organization. And the AI learned that I think it was the CIO, I might be getting this wrong, but an executive was about to replace that AI with a new AI, and then surfaced up to the individual executive evidence that he had been having an affair, effectively blackmailing him because he was intending to replace one AI with another. And Anthropic, or the research paper that I read, was surfacing this as an example of misalignment of values and how we have to be concerned about this as we go forward. So this is more of a new concern that we have, a new risk that we have to manage that is specific to AI. Same with the hallucinations that we've seen many examples of, and increasingly new regulatory obligations associated with law specifically governing artificial intelligence. So all of the different components that you see, and they're called, we sort of identified them as risks. They exist along a continuum, but some of them are actually quite new in the AI context, okay? And so as lawyers, or if you're at all curious from a legal point of view, then I would say here's where we're starting to spend more and more of our time to better understand the risks and figure out what we do to mitigate those risks, whether it's in contracts, whether it's in regulation, whether it's in case law, okay? So whether like court judgments. And we draw from principles. So we'll draw from some of the key principles that have surfaced around responsible AI. Now go back to 2018 or 2019, when there was this really great pinwheel that was put out by the Berkman Klein Institute at Harvard. And it was demonstrating 90 plus different ethical frameworks for artificial intelligence. And what they did is they ultimately synthesized those 90 plus frameworks. There were some Canadian Government of Canada frameworks that were included there as well, some not, but they synthesized those, and they established sort of key principles that emerged from the different different frameworks. And so this doesn't perfectly align with that, but when I looked at that pinwheel and I looked at their analysis, I sort of drew out of that what I think the main responsible AI principles are, including in looking at the ISO 42001 standard for it's a management standard for responsible AI. And so I look at the key principles as being privacy as one of the top principles, fairness, bias, and non-discrimination. So being able to clarify what the standards for those are, and B, being able to articulate how your systems meet those standards. That's a really tough one. Fairness can be a tough one to unpack, but it's a robust area of debate. And there's a lot that is being done to create a bit of clarity around that. The safety and the robustness of those of those systems is another key component. AI safety, ever since I would say the Trump administration came into the US, the concept of safety has probably taken on more dominance than anything else. Before, we were talking much more about some of the principles of fairness and non-discrimination as much. Now I think we've shifted more to safety. And it makes sense because there's a huge push to be able to develop and use these systems. And at the very least, we need to make sure that these systems are operating safely. And that they are performing up to standard so that we understand what the standard is. We understand what the sort of thresholds of reliability and accuracy are, and that they're consistently meeting those standards. Transparency is a very fluid field right now. So the question of how much disclosure do you need to provide when you're using AI? What does that disclosure look like? I was on an Air Canada flight at the end of last year, and there was a picture from on the back of the screen, they had run different ads, and there was one from KPMG, and it had this woman in a tutu kicking a soccer ball. And I actually took a picture of it because I was like, oh, there's something about this image that looks sort of funny. And then at the bottom, it actually said, this picture is AI generated. And the reason I took a picture of it is because I thought, this is an example of transparency. And I had to sort of pause to say, well, I wonder why I care. Like, I wonder why I need to know that this is AI generated. And I'd be curious about your feedback as well at the end of this. If you want to know that. So in some instances, absolutely, I would want to know because it matters to me. In the context of a KPMG ad, I just don't know. And so I was really curious about it. I thought I'd raise it and get some of your feedback. But transparency matters in law because it may be a disclosure that creates an opt-in or opt-out obligation. So for instance, in New York City, actually, where they implemented a law related to HR practices, stating that if you're going to be using AI in the context of hiring or recruiting, you have to disclose that you're using AI and you have to provide a bias assessment that's at least 1 year old or had been conducted a year prior so that people can be aware if they're subject to AI analysis of their, whether it's their video, their resume, whatever it may be, their written sample. So that then allows people to make decisions about whether or not they want to submit to it. The issue becomes if you don't give them an alternative. And so you give them disclosure, there's no alternative. At the very least, I suppose they can challenge if they feel the system has been discriminatory. And we've seen that happen in the context of Workday, where a claim against Workday, a class action against Workday, was filed in respect of a proposed alleged discrimination claim on the basis of race, age, and disability. And then there's accountability. That's a really key RAI principle because it requires whether you're a developer, deployer, or user, it requires certain actions from you to demonstrate that you have been thoughtful about the risks and opportunities of the system and that you have taken appropriate action to de-risk the system and to de-risk the use of that system as much as possible. And if not, then how do you justify your use of this system, recognizing what the risks were? Now, accountability matters is most effective when there's enforcement, and enforcement now requires some kind of body of law to be able to indicate what those rules are that you're going to be held to, those expectations, and then what are the repercussions of not meeting those standards. Curious to know if you have anything else that you think is a key responsible AI principle. I would love to hear in the discussion, and I'll probably go on another 10 minutes and then I'll leave it for an open discussion. I'd love to hear if you have anything that you would like to share. So with all of this, the increasing capabilities of AI, the demonstration that the Turing test is being met, some of the uniqueness of AI, and the concerns that there are new risks that are being presented that we need to account for, we need to deal with. The fact that there is some coalescing around the responsible AI principles. And so, arguably the global commons has a little bit of more clarity as to what we're sort of trying to promote, trying to protect. We do see that there is more and more discussion about actually legislating around artificial intelligence. And there are a few countries, states that have gone ahead and passed legislation with respect to artificial intelligence. This is an old map. It's not super reflective, but I do like that it shows where you can find, like, now I think, yeah, South Korea is there. So you can see that there are a number of countries that are turning their minds to how we actually legislate AI. And I just want to pause there. I want to pause to explain what that means. So often, and I'm not saying this is consistently across all the countries listed here, but often when we're talking about legislating something to do with AI, we are talking not about the technology. It is not a law that is telling you how you can or cannot build AI systems. It is a law that tells you how you can or cannot use AI systems. And so it is very use case oriented, question asking. If you are going to use artificial intelligence in this particular area, what are some of the risks associated with that use? Who may be harmed? How? And what are you going to do to mitigate those risks as much as possible, which might include putting people on notice that they are using artificial intelligence. And so they have to assume the risk themselves. When I had a Waymo car drive me around in Los Angeles, I clearly knew there is not a human driver there, very obvious, and I had to assume certain risks associated with getting into that car. So I want you to think of the law as establishing an accountability framework for the use of artificial intelligence, and not really about how you create artificial intelligence or develop artificial intelligence systems. Now, in Canada, we actually had a draft law on the books under the last government that was called the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. With the new government coming in, we now have a minister of AI, and that's a new portfolio altogether. And the minister of AI has talked about regulation that is light, tight, and right. So really trying to actually roll back regulation of artificial intelligence, even though I'll say that I think it was a CBC poll at the end of last year, 85% of Canadians polled wanted to see some kind of regulation of AI in order to protect against harms. What this government is saying is the current climate is not going to adapt to that. Instead, we have to really focus in on what is the regulation that's needed, what is the minimum regulation that's needed in order to incentivize innovation, catalyze adoption without increasing risk too greatly. And so in this instant, we've got light, tight, and right. And so far, what that has meant, by all accounts, is that the privacy law that we had on the actually being consulted upon late last year, which has been consulted upon for many years, and now we're actually just waiting for it to get passed, that it's been augmented to include certain elements of AI protections, particularly harms in specific areas. My understanding is harms in related to like deep fakes and particularly children. So what we saw recently with Grok's sexualized images of children, that if this law were to pass, that would be an absolute no-go. I mean, it should be anyway and anywhere, and there's existing law that should prevent that. But that's an example of where we're really trying to drill down and provide some kind of protections. And this is all assuming these components make their way into that law and that law is ultimately retabled. But I understand that it will be. So I just want to give you a sense of what the regulatory landscape then looks like. So in Canada, we're waiting. The Bill C-27 So this is us trying to codify protections that we had talked about throughout the presentation. That's not going to advance, but we'll see some element of AI law come out through sectors and possibly embedded into the privacy law, as I just discussed. The EU Artificial Intelligence Act is in force. The EU has sort of ebbed and flowed in terms of how much they want to advance with enforcement. They've sort of pulled back a little bit in the face of U.S. Um, you know, I guess concern with having anybody else regulate their companies. So the EU has sort of pulled back a little bit, but it's still there. It's still on the books, and it's the most robust, probably the most stringent law that is out there. And then there are other laws that are related to AI, but they're much more specific. So I think there's a law in China that's related to AI, but it's mainly related to generative AI or social media, the use of AI in social media or use of AI in recommendation systems. South Korea actually just came out with a law, or just came into force actually, and that is my understanding is it's quite a robust law as well. In the US, we have the executive order at the federal level that really talks about global leadership and dominance in AI. And the earlier executive order was repealed, which was a little bit more about sort of non-discrimination, civil rights, privacy enhancing technologies. At the state level, you have something like Colorado's Consumer Protection for AI. Now, President Trump just imposed a new executive order that would try to gut some of the state's ability to regulate in the areas of AI. We'll see if that withstands judicial review. But if we end up at that level, we may be in a position where you have cities like New York City with laws, states having their own laws, individual countries having their own laws, and then in some instances, global governance, global AI governance consortiums, or some, maybe frameworks or charters. That creates a very fragmented system in trying to actually regulate the use of AI. But we'll stay tuned on that, see what happens. Otherwise, there are frameworks that are in place. The National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US put out an AI risk management framework. I think it was January 23 or 24. Very good if you're curious as to how you can organize, like what are some of the big questions you need to be asking and how you can organize to de-risk those systems. And then sectors are coming out to say, well, in financial services, for instance, we're worried about these three things, and this is what we want you to do to demonstrate compliance with our worries. And then there are standards like the ISO standard that I had mentioned. So just to give you a bit of a landscape, as much as we talk about capabilities and principles and areas of law and ethics and risks, the way we're codifying that is in actual horizontal law in some cases, or sectoral law. So it's not one law that applies across the board on AI. It might be a directive, guidance, or law that applies in a particular sector. Healthcare, financial services, transport, those are great examples. And then we have standards that we can rely upon to help us exercise diligence and compliance. And I will stop there because I did promise 15 minutes of discussion. So if there are any questions or if you have any reactions, I'd love to hear what they are. I'll stop sharing.
Carole, thank you so much for this talk. It was really appreciated by myself, and I'm sure the rest of the group. I sure saw a lot of people that are were paying quite close attention, so I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion now. Thank you, Carole.